A young couple become the victims of a terrifying assault.
This crime scene was one of the bloodiest that I've ever seen.
I could see a slash across his throat.
She had several lacerations to her hands as well as to her abdomen.
For law enforcement, one of their biggest priorities was to figure out who would want to do this to either of them.
The evidence seems to point to a jealous stalker.
She had mentioned that a guy named John with dreads had followed her.
He would pop up like in crazy places.
But as the investigation unfolds, detectives begin to question everything about the case.
This trail of blood led to the kitchen.
There was 2 knives missing.
How did the suspect know exactly where to go to get the knife?
It did not make sense to me.
The math just was not mathing. Detectives are starting to believe that John really didn't exist.
January 17th, 2010. It's 3:30 a.m. in Shreveport, Louisiana, when police receive an emergency call from 24-year-old Kimethia Coleman.
Shreveport police, what's your emergency?
Somebody's trying to kill my boyfriend.
Oh, I gotta kill your boyfriend?
Oh, yes!
She's saying that her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, they both have been attacked. This person ran out of the apartment and she doesn't know where he is.
Help me, please. I took the knife out of him. Help me, please.
Okay, he was Sam.
Help me.
Minutes later, officers arrive at the address, where they find 29-year-old Brian Spinks lying motionless by the door.
I could see stab wounds about the head. I could see a slash across his throat. There was a great amount of blood to where when you step into the living room, you could hear the sound of liquid in the carpet.
They were able to quickly establish that Brian was dead.
Kim is screaming hysterically, and she's yelling, "Why would he do this?"
The officers secure the scene and escort Kimethia out of the apartment. They try to calm her down so she can explain what happened.
Kimethia appeared to be in a state of shock. She was covered head to toe in blood, and she was very distraught.
When they asked her who did this, she described a man with dreadlocks in a red shirt. She said he left. She didn't know which direction he went.
And it's normal for a victim or someone who sees a traumatic event not to be able to divulge what occurred right then. She was also injured, so we had to get her treatment and take her to the hospital.
She had several lacerations to her hands as well as to her abdomen and her leg.
As Kimethia is transported to a hospital, homicide detectives arrive to take over the investigation. Before entering the apartment, they speak with 2 potential witnesses.
The initial responding officers had located a vehicle at the apartment complex. The vehicle was stopped and the individuals were contacted and found out to be friends of Miss Kimethia Coleman.
They were with her earlier in the day. They had arrived at the apartment to check on her when she didn't answer her phone. Whenever we interview witnesses, we want to find out anything we can, whatever they know. What type of relationship they have with the victim, what knowledge they have prior to the events that occurred.
For law enforcement, one of their biggest priorities was to figure out who was Brian Spinks, who was Kimethia Coleman, and who would want to hurt them, who would want to do this to either of them.
Brian Dennis Spinks was born December 15, 1980, in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up in a family with a proud history of military service.
Brian was the second child, but the first boy. And subsequently, he had 2 younger brothers.
His father was in the military. Our mother, she was a DOD, Department of Defense employee for security assistance.
It goes all the way back to his great-grandfather being in the Korean War. My father and my grandfather were both in World War II. And then, of course, me in the Marine Corps.
After high school in 1999, Brian followed the family tradition and enlisted in the Air Force. But before he deployed, his life changed.
I met Brian Spinks, I want to say back in the summer of 2000. It was my senior year of high school. Brian had just joined the Air Force, and he had swung by the high school to help with all the recruiters. Brian was very attractive, and his smile was remarkable. We dated for about 6 months, and I found out I was pregnant with Amani.
In January 2001, Brian became a father, but the romance didn't last.
He, of course, military obligations, and I felt alone because the military had #1 priority.
He was going to do the full ride. Wouldn't have had a problem getting a job after the Air Force.
Shortly after Monty was born, Brian was gone to Iraq. He took long tours.
He, did what the best he could and spoke to his son when he could, had the relationship with his son's mom. They co-parented.
It was very difficult, especially as Amani started getting older.
When we did spend time together in person, we had a good time. He made me feel loved. I cried when he left. But I understand what he was doing. He had to serve his country.
While stationed in Montgomery, he had a daughter with another woman in the Air Force.
Once she became pregnant, she got discharged from the Air Force and went home to, I think, Buffalo, New York. So that was difficult in itself. And Brian only got to see her a few times. They did the best he could from a distance.
But while on deployment, Brian's focus was on the men in his unit.
Brian and I met when I was in the Air Force back in 2002. He and I were both stationed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. He was kind of the organizer between all of us. We all just kind of meshed because this is the only family that we had. Our families were in different countries, different places, and he made sure that we had a place to come and congregate.
By the time he returned home in 2008, Brian was ready to focus on his family.
When he came home, it was always about Amani.
It was good, He talked, he checked on me. I ain't want for nothing.
At a friend's get-together later that year, Brian met someone new. A young woman named Kimethia Coleman.
Kimethia Coleman was from a small town about 30 minutes outside of Shreveport. Just about everyone who knew her loved her and liked her. She was very popular. Prom queen, homecoming queen, you name it.
Kimethia was a very sweet girl. I talked to her almost every Sunday, and she would always be in church.
Kimethia went on to go to Grambling State University. She chose a life of service as a social worker. She dedicated her life to serving and helping other people.
She was seemed like almost the perfect girl to introduce to your family and to settle down with. Brian had never been this serious about someone until Kimethia came along.
But little more than a year after they began dating, Brian has been killed by an unknown assailant. And investigators are now questioning 2 women outside the couple's apartment.
One was a longtime friend, the Kimethia Colemans, and then the second individual was her sister. So the friend advises that she had been at the club with her sister and Miss Coleman downtown in Shreveport.
The women say Camethea seemed upset that evening, and it had something to do with another man.
She had mentioned to the sisters that a guy named John with dreads had followed her. One of the sisters said that she did see someone at the club with dreads, but a lot of black males at that time wore dreads, and so nothing stood out to her.
They say Brian was also at the club, but neither he nor Camethea stayed for long.
There's a brief conversation between the two, and Brian leaves. Then the friends notice, minutes later, Camethea leaves.
And within a few minutes of Camethea leaving, they left to see if Camethea's car was still there. Then they didn't see it. So they went to Brian's to make sure she got where she was going. When they got there, they heard the screaming, and they saw the police coming, and they knew something was terribly wrong.
To detectives, the women appeared genuine in their account of the evening. So the investigation is just beginning.
We didn't have enough to go on, so we needed to speak with Camethea to find out who is John and get more information on why he followed her to Brian's apartment.
Coming up, evidence reveals the brutality of the attack.
The fact that the knife was broken is indicative of a very powerful or angry strike.
And detectives speak with Camethea.
She got a gentleman. They come back from the kitchen.
After speaking with Camethea Coleman's friends about the events leading up to the fatal stabbing of Brian Spinks, investigators turn their attention to the crime scene.
Police are not able to talk to Kim. Her wounds are being tended to, and they're hoping that the scene could give them the answers to this puzzle.
This crime scene was one of the bloodiest that I've ever seen. They observed what they thought to be at least 30 wounds to Brian. The cut from his neck, which almost had decapitated Brian, was what the lethal blow was. The amount of blood in the apartment and the amount of injuries that Brian sustained is indicative of a person with a lot of rage or anger. They have some reason to be mad enough to do that kind of damage and that much damage to another individual.
The murder weapons, a pair of knives found near Brian's body, seem to confirm their assessment.
There was a knife that was intact. There was also another knife that was close by that was a handle, and the blade was located in another part of the living room. The fact that the knife was broken is indicative of a very powerful or angry strike.
This trail of blood led to the kitchen, and they notice that on the kitchen counter is this knife block.
There was 2 knives missing from the knife block that also match the knives that were laying next to Brian Spinks' body.
And now they are able to kind of put the pieces together that these 2 knives came off the kitchen counter.
We did search the front door to see any type of jarring or kick marks or pry marks or anything, and none were located.
They start wondering, how did he get in? Did someone leave a door unlocked?
Police canvass the apartment complex, but none of the neighbors they speak to saw what happened. That leaves one person who might be able to identify the killer, and she's in the hospital.
Police now find that Camithia's wounds are not life-threatening, so they are able to talk with her.
Camithia was brought to the Violent Crimes Office there at the Shreveport Police Department, roughly around 7 a.m.
Obviously, we all know why we're here. We're investigating the stabbing of Brian.
Is he okay?
We'll discuss all that. Will you talk to us?
Is Brian okay? It's always my mom.
He's dead.
His ass follow me.
Camithia tells police that she was out on the town. It was a girls' night out.
They went to a couple of different establishments, had a few drinks, and then they ended up at Gigi's. Gigi's is one of the larger clubs in downtown Shreveport. Not long after they got to Gigi's, they saw Brian.
Tell me about that.
We talked and he got upset and he left.
Camithia advised us that whenever her and Brian went out separately, that they weren't supposed to meet up at the same club or go to the same places.
They had an agreement that if one comes to the club, the other one has to leave. So Brian leaves.
She said that she decided to go back to Brian's apartment to make sure that everything was cool.
Camithia advised us that her and Brian were back at his apartment. And they were kind of talking.
All of a sudden, and he stabbed Brian. He had like 2 or 3 times. And all I do, I know I hit him a couple of times.
She said she tried to jump on him, and he pushed her back. After he finished stabbing Brian, he just gets up and runs off.
You keep saying ass. Who was the ass?
Camithia explains that John was a man she dated casually in the past, and he seemed to have gotten the wrong idea.
I mean, I told him there would never be anything because I was with him. I was crying. And I mean, after a couple of months, he got the picture, but then he showed back up. He would pop up like in crazy places.
Camithia stated she saw him at the library. She also saw him near her apartment and later saw him at the club with her friends.
Despite the alarming run-ins with this man over the past month, Camithia seems strangely unable to provide investigators with any details.
She could never tell us a phone number, or she couldn't even tell us his last name. She stated that he drives different cars and he will call her from different payphones.
And the fact that she can't give us specific information about this John had us starting to question exactly what she was telling us.
Police realized that she could still be in shock. So they decided to go to the cell phones.
They asked Camithia for permission to go through her cell phone.
There are 3 voicemails on her phone. 2 of them are from friends talking about going out that night and making plans for the night. And then that 3rd voicemail is from Brian.
He left the voicemail in between the time he left the club and the time that she arrived at his apartment. He advised that he was done. He was breaking up with her. Prior to us hearing that, it appeared that her and Brian's relationship was fine.
As the detectives confront her with this voicemail, she changes. Her demeanor changes.
Hey, Kim. Why did he break up with you, Mom?
He didn't break up with me tonight. We always go through this. It's not a big deal.
Officer just left him at the morgue. So yeah, it's a big deal. It's a very big deal.
4 hours after Brian Spinks was found stabbed to death in his apartment. Investigators have just heard a voicemail from that same night in which he broke up with his girlfriend, Kimethia Coleman. The new information has them questioning if her story of a violent home invasion by a jealous stalker is true.
At that point, she asks to speak to Detective Farquhar alone. They had developed a bit of a rapport, and she trusted him in a way that she hadn't developed trust with the other detectives.
We step outside into a little room to where we could still watch Kimethia and Detective Farquhar in their interview, but Kimethia can't see us.
I was hoping that she would finally confide in me exactly what happened.
What did you sleep tonight, girls? Don't be embarrassed, okay? It's just me. They're out of here.
At that point, she started telling me that Brian had, in the past as well as that night, has hit her and abused her, but she felt that she deserved it, and so she didn't say anything to anyone.
Kimethia stated that they argued in Brian's apartment, that he'd been drinking, he was drunk, and she stated that he grabbed her by the hand, causing a minor bruise, and then Brian grabbed her throat, strangling her.
She said she pushed him off, and that's when he went into the kitchen and got a knife.
No, it's harder. You gotta tell me if he comes back from the kitchen.
According to Kimethia, he begins to stab her about the legs and stomach area.
She said she had to do something in order to defend herself in that moment.
So she, at that point, got up, went into the kitchen, got her own knife.
And I was like, if I don't do something, I'll kill you.
So you just kept stabbing. When did his throat get cut? Because it was cut bad.
The guy he followed me to.
Sean did?
Mm-hmm.
Was he in the apartment when all this happened?
Yes, he come in, and I was like, I did. I was like, what are you doing there?
She's changing the story now. It has now gone from John breaking into the apartment and attacking Brian to John walking into the apartment as she and Brian were fighting.
It kind of confused her story. The fact that she brought John back in did not make sense to me.
So he showed up in the middle of y'all fighting? And what all did he do?
He got the knife and just started jamming or whatever. I guess he was trying to make it look like I did.
It made no sense to anyone in that room. Like, the math just was not mathing. At this point, detectives are starting to believe that John really didn't exist. The question that the detectives asked was, why didn't you just leave? You're being attacked, you're able to get away, but instead of leaving, you grab a weapon and you come back to the fight.
I was trying to protect myself. I was trying to talk to him, tell him to calm down. I'm like, okay, are you really gonna do this right now?
At that point, I advised Detective Holmes and Agent Dunkel to come back in. I asked Kimethia to repeat what she had told me to them. At that point, she advised for an attorney. So the interview was concluded.
Since it appears the stabbing was a crime of passion, police charge Kimethia Coleman with manslaughter. Under Louisiana state law, they have 72 hours to gather any additional evidence.
Within the 72-hour period, a detective will gather all the pertinent information to corroborate the charge or upgrade it to second-degree murder. And with that being said, they would gather more evidence, talk to more witnesses, talking to anybody that knew her or Brian Spinks and their relationship.
Coming up, witnesses provide troubling new details about events leading up to the murder.
She threatened to beat his ass there at the club.
And medical analysis casts doubt on Camithia's story.
The coroner identified 64 stab wounds.
It's hard for me to fathom this incident being self-defense.
It's been nearly 12 hours since Brian Spinks' murder, and loved ones have started to learn the tragic news.
I just had randomly come in to my mom's house, and she hung up the phone and she screamed my name, and it was just something about the way she screamed it. And she told me the news that Brian was killed. Just in shock.
With Camithia Coleman in custody, detectives turn their attention to locating the alleged stalker she continues to claim murdered her boyfriend.
Now that Camithia's story is not making much sense, it's very important for police to rule out the John theory. Police did locate a person that fit John's description. He said he didn't know Camithia and he didn't know Brian. They weren't able to find any type of evidence on him, no blood, no knife wounds.
With the suspect having to be so close to the victim, it would have been nearly impossible for the person to not have some kind of evidence transfer from the victim to their person.
Blood is very slippery, and when someone is stabbing someone, generally the knife will slip and they will cut themselves during the event. This gentleman that was stopped had no injuries whatsoever on him.
It was very clear, this is not John.
Not only are investigators unable to find John, there is no evidence he exists at all.
Surveillance cameras were captured from Gigi's. There was no black male with dreadlocks with a red shirt that was walking around Gigi's, stalking her.
We were unable to locate any witnesses that saw this guy, John, or any video to corroborate Camithia's statement that she saw him at the club or that she saw him at the library.
It became apparent to police that Camithia had literally sent them on a goose chase to find another suspect that was non-existent.
The discovery means there were only 2 people in the apartment when the stabbing occurred: Brian and Camithia.
She stabbed him in a rage. There was no John in the picture whatsoever. But it is better for detectives to still go a little bit further to get more evidence, talk to her family, talk to friends.
I did receive a phone call from Brian's father, and he advised that Brian, within the past couple of weeks, was getting ready to part ways with Camithia.
His description to me was, "Dad, I'm being smothered." He told me, wasn't seeing any other girls, just her. But she was smothering him. And he needed some time away.
She had been pressuring him about marriage, and he didn't feel like he was ready for that.
She was getting up at night, going in his phone, going in his emails, searching the house, going through the drawers, looking for some type of incriminating evidence that he's dating another girl. It progressively got worse. the jealousness and the insecurities.
Brian's loved ones say the tension between him and Camethea finally reached a breaking point on the night of January 17th.
Air Force OSI detectives interviewed the Brian Spinks friends who went out with him that night. They state that Brian was at Gigi's dancing with a friend, but not intimately or anything of that nature, just a friendly dance with another female. Camethea sees Brian dancing with this female. She gets enraged and figures this must be a side piece, and they argue.
She threatened to beat his ass there at the club for dancing with someone else.
That night, I saw a different side of Kim that I had never seen before. I had never seen her react this way. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and we sat down with Kim. She said to me, she was like, Shane, I'm sorry. I love him, and, I overreacted. And so, in my mind, the night was over, and everything was fine. I had no idea what happened after that until the next morning.
Through all the interviews that we did, we feel that Camethea was jealous, and that when Brian tried to break it off with her, that just made her lose her mind. And that if she couldn't have him, no one could.
Police in Shreveport, Louisiana have arrested Camethea Coleman for stabbing her boyfriend Brian Spinks to death. But Camethea insists she was acting in self-defense.
Being that there was accusation of abuse, we pulled up any type of police records, but there were no records between Brian Spinks or Camethea.
Investigators look to Brian's autopsy to provide definitive answers.
Once the coroner got him down to the morgue and they conducted the autopsy, they identified 64 stab wounds.
When somebody's trying to defend themselves from an attacker, they are trying to de-escalate the situation, trying to put a little distance between them and their attacker just to stop the incident from occurring. It's hard for me to fathom this incident being self-defense.
Detectives are left with, how is it that this 100-pound female was able to overtake this 5'11", muscle-bound male who's in the military?
When we got the autopsy report back, it showed that his blood alcohol level was over twice the legal limit, and that he probably would not have been able to fight back.
Her entire defense on the self-defense side was, he attacked me. There was no way that Brian, with the .174 blood alcohol content, attacked her, walked to the kitchen, came back, and stabbed her.
Camethea's own injuries also seem to contradict her story.
She first claimed that John had stabbed her, and then she claimed that Brian had stabbed her during their fight in which she was defending herself.
But the Caddo Parish coroner said that they were not penetrating, that they were superficial wounds, which would lead him to believe that they were self-inflicted.
Maybe the murder was not premeditated, but she went to extreme lengths to create evidence, to create the optics that would support her story. She was desperate to stay out of trouble, so much so that she harmed herself.
On January 19th, 2010, less than 72 hours after Brian's murder, Prosecutors upgrade Camithia's charges from manslaughter to second-degree murder.
Second-degree murder is the intentional killing of another person, whereas manslaughter is killing someone in the heat of the moment. The fact that she did 64 stab wounds to him as well as a severe laceration to his throat was more indicative that she meant to kill him.
The behavior they said she displayed wasn't the Kim I know, wasn't the Kim I've talked to. I couldn't believe the viciousness.
A trial date is set, but as her day in court approaches, Camithia's attorneys introduce a new strategy for her defense.
She pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. There were motions filed, there was a mental evaluation conducted, and she was deemed incompetent to stand trial. She was transferred to a mental health facility for 90 days. At the end of that 90 days, she had a second evaluation.
November 2011, it was determined that Camithia Coleman was able to stand trial and testify.
On April 23, 2012, Camithia Coleman's murder trial begins. Despite the results of her psychiatric evaluation, her defense remains the same.
Battered wife syndrome was one of the elements of her insanity defense, that she was beaten enough and that she was abused and endured so much abuse that one day she just couldn't take anymore and she fought back.
The defense tried to paint Brian as an abusive person and tried to claim that he had PTSD because he had served in the Middle East and that he came back and took all of that out on Camithia.
For prosecutors, the question is whether the jury will believe it.
Only two people know what really occurred during the relationship, and one of them is no longer here to tell their story.
At her murder trial, Camithia Coleman claims the abuse she suffered at the hands of her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, drove her to commit a desperate act of self-preservation. Police and prosecutors say otherwise.
Throughout the investigation and throughout the preparation for the trial, there was just no evidence that pointed to Brian being an abusive person.
She was saying that he beat on women and he beat on me. Brian wouldn't hit a fly.
Camithia Coleman is a disturbed female who could not take no from her boyfriend, who did not want to be with her anymore. That's what made her snap.
Prosecutors present Camithia's 911 call as definitive proof her actions were premeditated.
I went back and listened to that phone call. You can hear Brian in the background. She gets real loud and kind of screams. And if you listen closely, you can hear Brian start to gurgle.
Okay, what's going on there?
I think that is when she delivered the final blow while she was on the phone with 911.
Hearing his voice one last time, crying for help, was truly gut-wrenching.
I can't imagine a human being doing what she did to somebody. What she did was... That man didn't deserve to leave like that.
Who would have thought? A sweet young lady with a future, a loving family. Who would believe she would do such a horrendous crime? I just couldn't believe it. And she turned into another person that night, as if she was possessed.
The jury in this trial deliberated 2 hours, and they came back with a unanimous guilty as charged verdict of second-degree murder.
Camethea Coleman is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
She will not spend another day in freedom. She'll be locked up, but that still doesn't help his friends and family.
We was trying to plan Amani a big surprise birthday party because it was going to be the first time Brian was in the U.S. when his birthday hit.
She took that from me. And man, that was supposed to be my guide through life, you know? Like, she took that, and I can't get that back.
I believe Brian would be extremely proud of his son, of the man that he has become.
I wasn't completely stripped because I got a grandson that reminds me of every time I look at him and talk to him. His same voice. Brian still is.
We respect what he did in the service, the sacrifice that he made. Great father, willing to do anything for the kids, even though it's from afar.
I still feel his spirit around me. He was a good person, you know? No matter what happened, you know, even how he died, that ain't who he was. My father wasn't abusive. He took care of his kids. I just want people to know that my father was a good man.
At 3:30 in the morning on January 17th, 2010, the city of Shreveport, Louisiana was wrapped in a silence, so heavy it almost felt unreal, the kind of quiet that only exists in hours when most of the world is asleep and only a few lives are still hanging by a thread. Inside a small apartment complex, behind closed doors that looked no different from any other unit in the building, something violent and irreversible had already unfolded. When the emergency call came through, the dispatcher on the other end was met with a voice that was shaking so hard it barely held together. A young woman screaming that someone was trying to kill her boyfriend, her words breaking apart as panic swallowed every attempt at clarity. She could barely explain what had happened, only that everything had turned into chaos, that blood was everywhere, and that the man she loved was gone somewhere inside that nightmare she could no longer control. Within minutes, patrol units were racing through the empty streets, lights cutting through the darkness, as officers arrived at the scene expecting uncertainty, but instead walking straight into something far more disturbing than they had prepared for. The apartment door opened into a space that immediately told its own story without a single word being spoken. The smell hit first, metallic and thick, followed by the sight of a living room that looked as if it had been swallowed by violence itself. Blood was not just present, it dominated everything, soaking into the carpet, marking the walls, and creating a trail that led from the entryway deeper into the apartment as if something had been dragged through panic and rage. Near the door lay the body of 29-year-old Brian Spinks, motionless, surrounded by the aftermath of a struggle so intense it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Officers noted multiple stab wounds across his body, the most devastating being a deep slash across his throat that suggested not just intent to harm, but an overwhelming force behind the attack. The floor beneath him was slick in places, and every step the officers took created a faint, unsettling sound as their boots pressed into the soaked carpet. There was no movement, no sign of life, only the stillness that follows something that cannot be undone. In another part of the apartment, a young woman was found in a state of complete emotional collapse. Camethea Coleman was covered in blood from head to toe, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her voice breaking into hysterical fragments as she tried to explain what had happened but kept circling back to the same desperate conclusion that someone had attacked them, that a man with dreadlocks and a red shirt had burst into their home and destroyed everything in seconds. Her injuries were visible, deep cuts across her hands, her abdomen, and her leg, suggesting she had been part of the violence rather than simply a witness to it. Yet her words painted a picture of an outside attacker, a stranger who had come and vanished into the night. Officers did what they were trained to do in moments like this, separating her from the scene, trying to calm her enough to piece together a timeline, but her shock made coherence almost impossible. Everything about her condition suggested trauma, but trauma alone does not solve a case. It only deepens the urgency to understand what truly happened inside those walls. As investigators stepped further into the apartment, they began noticing details that would later become critical fractures in the original narrative. The violence had not been random or scattered. It had direction, almost intention. A trail of blood led toward the kitchen, where a knife block sat on the counter, eerily intact except for the obvious absence of 2 knives. On the floor nearby, investigators found the weapons themselves, one broken at the handle, the other stained and discarded close to the victim. The break in one of the knives suggested force, so intense that it had snapped during use, the kind of detail that spoke of repeated, forceful impact rather than a single defensive moment. There were no signs of forced entry at the door, no broken locks, no indication that someone had fought their way inside from the outside world. The apartment was sealed in a way that suggested whoever had been inside either had access, or was already there when everything began. That single observation began to shift the entire foundation of the case. Outside the apartment, 2 individuals who had come to check on Camethea stood waiting, their presence adding another layer to the timeline. They explained that they had been with her earlier in the evening, that it had been a night out in downtown Shreveport, a normal social gathering that had slowly unraveled into something far more complicated. They had not been inside the apartment when the attack occurred, but they had arrived shortly afterward, drawn by unanswered calls and growing concern. When they reached the complex, they heard the screams and saw the flashing lights, realizing immediately that something had gone horribly wrong. Their statements added context but not clarity, and as detectives began asking questions about relationships, movements, and emotions leading up to the night, a name surfaced repeatedly, a man described only as John, a figure Camethea claimed had been following her for weeks, a man with dreadlocks who seemed to appear and disappear without pattern, a shadow woven into her account of fear and paranoia. At first, this detail seemed like a potential breakthrough. A jealous stalker with unknown motives, a suspect who could explain the eruption of violence. But even as detectives wrote the name down, something about it felt unstable, too vague, too inconsistent, lacking the kind of grounding that real suspects usually carried. No full name, no address, no phone number, no verifiable identity, only fragments of sightings and fear. As the night deepened into morning and the investigation expanded, that single thread would begin to unravel in ways no one initially expected, raising a question that would eventually redefine the entire case. Was John a real person who had committed an unthinkable act, or was he something else entirely, a story constructed in the middle of chaos to explain something far more personal and far more devastating? In the early hours of that investigation, no one had the answer yet. But the scene itself was already suggesting that the truth inside that apartment was not going to be simple, and it was not going to match the first story told at the door. To understand what happened inside that apartment on January 17, 2010, investigators could not rely solely on forensic evidence or witness statements. They had to reconstruct something far more fragile and far more complicated, the emotional architecture of 2 people who, on the surface, looked like a normal couple but underneath had built a relationship filled with tension, dependency, and contradictions that no outsider could fully see until it collapsed. Brian Spinks was not someone who drifted through life without anchor points. Even before he met Camethea Coleman, his identity had already been shaped by structure, discipline, and responsibility. He had grown up in a family where service was not just a career path but a cultural inheritance. That environment created a man who understood duty in very rigid terms, where emotions were secondary to obligation and where stability often meant maintaining control over circumstances rather than surrendering to them. This way of moving through life made him dependable in professional settings, but in personal relationships it sometimes translated into emotional distance that others misread as detachment or lack of engagement. Those who knew him well described him as steady, someone who would show up when needed, someone who did not easily lose composure in high-pressure situations. But steadiness in crisis does not always translate into ease and intimacy, and that distinction would become important when examining his relationship with Camethea. Camethea Coleman came from a very different emotional environment. She was raised in a close-knit Southern community where social connection played a central role in identity. In her hometown near Shreveport, she was not just known, she was recognized in a way that created expectations of who she was supposed to be. She had been popular in school, involved in social activities that placed her in visible roles, and later pursued work in social services, a field that requires emotional engagement and attentiveness to others' needs. On the surface, she embodied warmth, accessibility, and relational depth. People who knew her often described her as someone who maintained strong emotional ties, someone who did not easily let go of relationships once they formed. When Brian and Camethea met, their differences did not initially appear as conflict. In fact, they seemed to complement each other in ways that created early attraction. Brian represented stability and consistency, someone whose life had structure and predictability, while Camethea represented emotional presence and social familiarity, someone who understood connection in a more immediate and expressive way. To those observing from the outside, the relationship looked balanced, even promising. But relationships are not static systems. They evolve through repeated interactions, and in this case, those interactions gradually exposed differences in expectation that neither party fully addressed at the beginning. Brian's lifestyle, shaped by military service and extended absences, meant that he was accustomed to emotional separation. He had learned to maintain relationships across distance, to compartmentalize presence and absence in a way that allowed him to function without constant emotional feedback. Camethea, however, experienced connection more continuously. For her, emotional presence was not something that could be paused or delayed without consequence. This difference did not immediately create rupture, but it created pressure, a slow accumulation of unmet expectations that would surface later as frustration, insecurity, and conflict. Friends who observed the relationship during its early years described moments of harmony interrupted by sudden arguments that seemed to emerge without clear cause. But what appeared sudden to outsiders was often the result of accumulated tension that had not been directly addressed. As time passed, the relationship developed patterns that became increasingly cyclical. Periods of closeness would be followed by emotional distance, which would then lead to attempts at reconnection, followed again by friction. These cycles did not break the relationship apart, but they changed its emotional tone. What had once been excitement began to feel more like dependence, and what had once been stability began to feel unpredictable in its emotional expression. By the time they reached the period leading up to 2010, their relationship was no longer defined by the simplicity of early attraction. It had become a space where emotional needs were not fully aligned, and where communication often carried underlying tension even when surface-level interactions appeared normal. Brian's friends later described him as increasingly aware that the relationship was becoming emotionally heavy, that he felt pressure to maintain a level of engagement that did not always match his internal capacity at that time. Camethea, on the other hand, was experiencing insecurity that manifested in ways that would later be described as jealousy and emotional intensity. These were not isolated traits, but responses within a dynamic where both individuals were reacting to the same disconnect from different emotional positions. In the weeks before the incident, there were signs that the relationship was under strain. Reports from friends and acquaintances suggested arguments about attention, trust, and perceived distance. There were also accounts of Camethea becoming increasingly sensitive to Brian's interactions with others, interpreting neutral social behavior as potential threats to the relationship. Brian, meanwhile, was reportedly considering separation, or at least emotional space, a fact that would later become central to understanding the events of the night in question. On the evening of January 17th, both individuals entered a social environment that would amplify existing tensions. The club setting in downtown Shreveport was loud, crowded, and filled with overlapping social interactions where boundaries between couples and acquaintances often blurred. In such environments, emotional reactions can intensify quickly because perception is shaped not only by reality, but by interpretation filtered through existing insecurities. Witnesses later recalled seeing Brian interacting socially with others, including brief conversations and dancing that were not inherently intimate, but were interpreted differently depending on perspective. At some point, Camethea became visibly upset, a reaction that would later be described by witnesses as a shift in her emotional state that contrasted sharply with her earlier demeanor that night. The exact trigger of that shift remains disputed, but what is clear is that it marked a turning point in how the night unfolded emotionally. After leaving the club environment, the separation between Brian and Camethea did not resolve the underlying tension. Instead, it moved into a more private space, the apartment, where external witnesses no longer existed and where the dynamics of their relationship could fully express themselves without interruption. This transition from public to private space is critical in understanding many domestic violence cases because it removes social regulation and leaves only the internal structure of the relationship itself. Inside that apartment, according to later investigation, emotional escalation reached its peak. Whether the confrontation began with conversation or argument is less clear than the fact that it ended in physical violence that was extreme in both intensity and duration. The severity of the injuries found on Brian's body suggested prolonged engagement, not a brief altercation. The number of stab wounds, the distribution of force, and the condition of the weapons all pointed toward a level of sustained emotional or psychological escalation that went far beyond spontaneous reaction. Camethea's account of the events would evolve over time, introducing elements such as an external attacker, shifting timelines, and varying explanations for how the violence began and progressed. These inconsistencies would later become central to the investigation, but at this stage, they were still being interpreted through the lens of shock and trauma, which can significantly affect memory recall and narrative structure. What investigators were left with in those early hours was not a single coherent story, but overlapping fragments of emotional truth, physical evidence, and conflicting interpretations. Brian Spinks was no longer just a victim in a crime scene. He had become the center of a relational history that needed to be understood in full if the events of that night were to be accurately reconstructed. And Camethea Coleman was no longer simply a survivor of a violent incident. She was also the only living witness to the final moments of a relationship that had been quietly destabilizing long before it reached that apartment door. It was just after 3:30 a.m. in Shreveport, Louisiana, when the quiet of the night was violently broken by a frantic 911 call that would set an entire investigation into motion. In that call, 24-year-old Camethea Coleman's voice cracked with panic and disbelief as she told the dispatcher that someone was trying to kill her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, and that the attacker had already fled the apartment. There was no calm, no clarity, only shock and fragmented urgency as she tried to explain what had just happened inside the place she and Brian shared. Within minutes, patrol units were racing through the near-empty streets, lights cutting through the darkness, sirens echoing off buildings that still slept. When officers arrived at the apartment complex, they were met with a scene that immediately told them this was not a simple disturbance or an exaggeration born of panic. Inside, the living room was transformed into something unrecognizable, the air heavy with the metallic smell of blood, the carpet saturated to the point that every step produced a disturbing, almost liquid sound beneath their boots. Brian Spinks was found near the entryway, his body motionless, his injuries severe and unmistakably fatal. Officers could immediately see deep stab wounds and a catastrophic slash across his throat, injuries that suggested not only intent but a level of force and rage that left no room for ambiguity about the outcome. The violence was concentrated, personal, and overwhelming, as if the attacker had not stopped until there was nothing left to destroy. Camethea was still inside the apartment when police arrived, hysterical, covered in blood, and screaming questions that mixed grief with disbelief. repeatedly asking why someone would do this, her emotional state so unstable that officers had to physically separate her from the scene and guide her outside to prevent further distress or contamination of evidence. Her injuries were visible and immediate, cuts across her hands, her abdomen, and her leg, suggesting she had been in close proximity to the violence, whether as a victim, witness, or participant was something investigators could not yet determine. As paramedics moved her toward medical treatment, detectives began their first careful steps into the apartment, knowing that every detail, every trace, every drop of blood would matter in reconstructing what had actually occurred in those final moments. The initial impression was overwhelming violence, but the deeper question forming in the minds of investigators was not just what had happened, but who had been inside that room when it did. Almost immediately, detectives began building a timeline based on fragmented accounts from witnesses and Camithia's initial statements, which described a man with dreadlocks wearing a red shirt who had allegedly followed her and then attacked Brian inside the apartment before fleeing. That detail, repeated in the chaos of the night, became the first anchor point of the investigation, the first suspect profile, and the first theory that detectives would attempt to verify or disprove. Outside the apartment, two individuals who had arrived after receiving no response to calls were detained and interviewed, both friends of Camithia who had spent the evening with her and her sister. Their statements placed Camithia and Brian at a club earlier in the night, separately but briefly intersecting, and suggested tension already existed between the couple before they ever returned home. According to them, Camithia had mentioned being followed earlier that evening by a man she referred to as John, a name that would quickly become central to the developing narrative even though no one could clearly define who he was. Inside the apartment, forensic investigators moved carefully through what they would later describe as one of the bloodiest crime scenes they had encountered. The pattern of blood spatter, the directionality of stains on walls and furniture, and the pooling on the floor all indicated prolonged, repeated stabbing rather than a single burst of violence. Brian's injuries were numerous, far exceeding what would be necessary to cause death, and included defensive wounds that suggested he had attempted to fight back or shield himself from repeated attacks. His throat injury, deep and decisive, appeared to be the final act, a wound that effectively ended the struggle. Nearby, detectives found two knives, one intact and one broken, its blades separated from the handle and lying at a distance, an indication of extreme force during use. The kitchen area showed signs of disturbance, and a knife block on the counter revealed that two knives were missing, both of which matched the weapons recovered near Brian's body, suggesting the attack began in close quarters and escalated quickly within the apartment itself. What puzzled investigators early on was the lack of forced entry, no signs of a break-in, no damaged locks, no signs that someone had violently entered from outside, which raised immediate questions about how the alleged attacker had gained access or whether he had been inside from the beginning. As detectives expanded their canvas of the scene, they began to notice inconsistencies that did not neatly align with the initial narrative provided by Camithia. The trajectory of movement within the apartment, the distribution of blood, and the positioning of both victim and evidence suggested a chaotic but contained struggle between individuals who were already inside the space rather than an external intruder who had burst in and fled. Meanwhile, Camithia, once stabilized enough to speak, repeated her account of a man with dreadlocks and a red shirt, but details remained vague, shifting slightly with each retelling and lacking specificity that could allow detectives to identify or locate such a person in a city surveillance network or among known associates. Officers canvassed the surrounding apartment complex, speaking with neighbors who reported hearing nothing unusual prior to the arrival of police, no shouting, no struggle, no distinct sounds that might align with a violent intrusion from outside. This absence of external corroboration began to weigh heavily on the developing theory of a stranger attack. Still, investigators did not dismiss Camithia's account outright, recognizing that trauma can distort memory and that victims or witnesses in shock often struggle to provide coherent details immediately after a violent event. However, the investigation required more than emotional interpretation. It required evidence that could stand independently of statements. As the early hours of the investigation continued, attention shifted toward understanding the relationship between Brian Spinks and Camethea Coleman, a couple who, by all outward appearances, had been building a stable life together. Friends and acquaintances described Brian as disciplined, shaped by his military background, someone who had served in the Air Force and maintained strong ties to family and structure. Camethea, on the other hand, was described as warm, social, and well-liked, someone who had been active in her community and known for her academic and social involvement. Together, they were seen as a relatively normal couple, not without conflict, but not outwardly troubled in a way that would predict such extreme violence. Yet the deeper investigators went, the more they began to understand that the surface narrative of stability often conceals fractures invisible to outsiders. Interviews with Camethea's friends revealed that the night had included movement between multiple locations, drinking, and shifting interactions between Brian and Camethea that suggested underlying tension. One detail that stood out early was a rule within their relationship, an understanding that if one arrived at a club, the other would leave, a boundary that hinted at issues of jealousy or control even before the night turned deadly. According to witnesses, Brian had been seen dancing with another woman in a non-intimate way, a moment that Camethea allegedly interpreted as betrayal, triggering a visible emotional reaction that escalated into confrontation. Although the night initially de-escalated, the emotional residue of that argument appeared unresolved. As detectives pieced together these fragments, the question began to shift from identifying an external attacker to understanding whether the violence originated from within the relationship itself. The presence of Camethea inside the apartment during the attack, her injuries, and the absence of any credible evidence of forced entry all began to converge into a troubling possibility that investigators could not ignore. Still, at this stage, the investigation remained open, suspended between competing narratives, one of a jealous stalker named John and another of a domestic conflict that escalated beyond control. What was certain was that Brian Spinks was dead, the result of repeated and brutal stabbing, and that the truth of what happened inside that apartment would require peeling back layers of contradiction, emotion, and uncertainty before it could fully emerge. By the time the case entered its second day, the investigation had already shifted from a search for an unknown intruder to a far more complicated question about what had actually happened inside Brian Spinks' apartment in the final minutes of his life. Detectives were no longer simply trying to identify a suspect. They were now trying to determine whether the story they had been given in the first frantic hours after the murder was even structurally possible. The initial narrative of a jealous stalker named John with dreadlocks had begun to weaken under the weight of surveillance footage, witness inconsistencies, and the absence of any physical evidence placing such a person at or near the scene. But even as that theory collapsed, another, more uncomfortable possibility began to take shape, one that required investigators to examine not a stranger entering the apartment, but the dynamics of the relationship between Brian and Camethea Coleman. Inside the homicide office, detectives began reconstructing Camethea's movements with increasing precision, pulling phone records, analyzing timestamps, and comparing witness accounts from the night of January 17th. What emerged was a fragmented but increasingly coherent timeline that placed both Brian and Camethea at the same nightclub earlier in the evening, though not always together. Witnesses described Brian dancing casually with another woman, a moment that seemed harmless on the surface, but appeared to trigger a strong emotional reaction from Camethea when she noticed it. According to multiple accounts, she confronted him, tension escalated, and at some point Brian left the club alone. Shortly afterward, Camethea also departed, creating a critical window of time that would later become central to the case. That gap, those missing minutes between separation and the 911 call, now represented the most important unknown in the investigation. Meanwhile, detectives working the crime scene continued to refine their understanding of the violence inside the apartment. The sheer number of stab wounds to Brian's body, later confirmed through autopsy to be over 60, suggested an intensity that went far beyond a single defensive encounter. The pattern of injuries indicated repeated strikes delivered with force, not a momentary burst of panic, but a sustained act of violence. His throat injury, deep and catastrophic, appeared to be the final act in a sequence of escalating attacks. Forensic specialists also noted the distribution of blood throughout the apartment, which suggested movement between rooms during the incident rather than a static confrontation in one location. Blood trails leading from the kitchen into the living room indicated that the attack had likely begun near the kitchen area, where the missing knives from the block were later confirmed as the weapons used. The fact that 2 knives were taken from the block and brought into the struggle suggested deliberate selection rather than accidental use, a detail that investigators could not ignore. At the same time, Camithia's account remained inconsistent in key areas. In her initial statements, she described an unknown male attacker who had followed her from earlier in the evening and entered the apartment to kill Brian. In later questioning, however, that narrative began to shift. Under pressure to explain the absence of physical evidence for this individual, she introduced variations in the story, sometimes emphasizing a struggle with Brian himself, other times returning to the idea of an external attacker. Detectives recognized this pattern as a critical warning sign in investigative psychology, where shifting narratives often indicate either confusion under trauma or an attempt to reconcile incompatible versions of events. To resolve the uncertainty surrounding the alleged stalker, investigators launched a targeted effort to identify or eliminate the existence of John. They reviewed surveillance footage from the club, nearby streets, and surrounding businesses. They examined known offenders in the area matching partial descriptions. They canvassed witnesses who had been present at Gigi's nightclub that night. Despite these efforts, no one could confirm the presence of a man matching Camithia's description. No credible sightings, no corroborating reports, no identifiable suspect with dreadlocks and a red shirt who moved in proximity to Camithia or Brian. Even more telling, investigators found no records linking Camithia to any individual named John in phone logs, social media, or known acquaintances. The absence was not just a gap, it was a void where a suspect should have been. That void began to reshape the investigation's direction. If John did not exist, then the violence inside the apartment could not be attributed to a third-party intrusion. It would have to be explained by the people who were actually inside the space. Detectives then turned their attention back to the physical evidence inside the apartment, re-examining it through a different lens. The lack of forced entry now carried greater significance. The positioning of furniture, the movement patterns indicated by blood trails, and the distribution of defensive wounds all suggested that Brian and Camithia had been together inside the apartment when the confrontation began. The knives taken from the kitchen supported the theory that the escalation occurred inside, not as a result of an external intrusion. Even the broken knife blade, found separated from its handle, pointed toward a level of force consistent with sustained close-contact violence. As investigators integrated forensic findings with timeline reconstruction, a more troubling narrative began to emerge. It suggested that Brian's death may have been the result of an internal conflict that escalated rapidly and violently within the confines of the apartment. This possibility did not immediately translate into conclusions, but it forced detectives to reevaluate Camithia's role in the events with greater scrutiny. At the same time, investigators were careful not to dismiss her injuries or emotional state, both of which indicated she had experienced trauma during the incident. However, the nature of those injuries became a point of detailed forensic analysis. Medical examiners reviewed the wounds and noted that while they were real, they appeared superficial compared to the fatal injuries inflicted on Brian. The pattern and depth of the cuts did not fully align with defensive wounds typically sustained during a sustained life-or-death struggle with a significantly stronger attacker. This discrepancy added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Further complicating matters was the discovery of Brian's voicemail left earlier that night, in which he indicated a desire to end the relationship. This communication reframed the emotional context of the evening entirely. What had once been viewed as a random act of violence by an unknown attacker now appeared increasingly connected to a deteriorating relationship marked by jealousy, control issues, and emotional volatility. Interviews with Brian's friends and family reinforced this emerging picture. They described Camithia as increasingly possessive in the weeks leading up to the incident, frequently checking Brian's phone, questioning his interactions, and expressing suspicion about his behavior. According to these accounts, Brian had been considering ending the relationship due to the growing emotional strain. This information aligned with the voicemail and suggested that the night of the murder may have represented a breaking point in a relationship already under significant pressure. As detectives compiled these findings, they returned to Camithia's interview, now analyzing her statements in light of the forensic and testimonial evidence. Her insistence on the presence of John appeared increasingly unsupported by any independent verification. Her shifting narrative regarding the sequence of events inside the apartment raised questions about consistency under pressure. And her decision to initially frame the incident as a home invasion, despite the absence of corroborating evidence, became a focal point of investigative concern. Eventually, the cumulative weight of these inconsistencies led detectives to formally reclassify the case. What had initially been treated as a homicide involving an unknown assailant was now being evaluated as a potential domestic violence incident that escalated into fatal violence. Based on the totality of evidence available at that stage, including the absence of forced entry, the forensic patterns inside the apartment, the elimination of the John suspect, and the emerging relationship dynamics, investigators made the decision to charge Camithia Coleman in connection with Brian Spink's death. The charge reflected not only the physical evidence, but also the belief that the violence originated within the relationship itself. Even with that decision, the investigation was far from over. Detectives understood that charges at this stage were not the end of inquiry, but the beginning of a legal process that would test every assumption, every interpretation, and every piece of evidence in court. What remained unresolved, and what would soon become the central focus of the case moving forward, was the question of intent, control, and whether the final moments inside that apartment represented a spontaneous eruption of violence or a calculated act that had been building long before the first knife was taken from the kitchen block. By the time the investigation reached its most critical stage, the case had transformed from a chaotic scene of uncertain identity into a tightly focused question of intent, responsibility, and truth under pressure. What had once been framed as a terrifying home invasion by an unknown stalker had now collapsed under forensic scrutiny, witness testimony, and the absence of any verifiable suspect matching the description of John. With that theory effectively dismantled, detectives were left facing a far more difficult reality. The evidence was increasingly pointing back inside the apartment and toward the only surviving witness to the final moments of Brian Spink's life, Camithia Coleman. The breakthrough did not arrive in a single dramatic revelation, but rather through the slow accumulation of contradictions that refused to reconcile. Surveillance footage from Gigi's nightclub remained one of the most decisive elements. Frame by frame, detectives confirmed that no individual resembling the alleged stalker appeared anywhere in the recorded environment. There was no man with dreadlocks trailing Camithia, no figure in a red shirt moving between exits, no presence that could plausibly account for the narrative she had first provided. This absence was not just investigative inconvenience, it was evidentiary collapse. At the same time, forensic reconstruction of the crime scene continued to yield patterns that reinforced internal conflict rather than external intrusion. The blood evidence showed directional movement consistent with a struggle contained within a single space, not a chase or forced entry scenario. The kitchen became a key focal point again, where 2 knives had been removed from a block, suggesting deliberate selection of weapons already inside the residence. The presence of both knives at the scene, one of them broken under extreme force, suggested repeated close-contact violence rather than a brief defensive encounter with an intruder. As detectives reevaluated Camithia's statements in light of these findings, the inconsistencies became more pronounced. Her initial claim of a stalking male who followed her from location to location could not be substantiated by any independent witness or electronic evidence. Her inability to provide identifying details about this individual further weakened the narrative. No phone records, no social media traces, no confirmed sightings, and no forensic evidence supported the existence of this third party. Instead, every verifiable piece of information led back to the apartment and the 2 people inside it. The breakthrough intensified when investigators obtained and fully analyzed Brian Spink's voicemail left shortly before his death. In it, he expressed clear intent to end the relationship with Camithia, a detail that fundamentally altered the emotional and situational context of the night. This was not a neutral evening that escalated unexpectedly, but one that now appeared to include a decisive emotional rupture at its core. When combined with witness accounts describing earlier jealousy at the nightclub, including Camithia's reaction to Brian dancing with another woman, a pattern began to emerge that suggested escalating emotional volatility throughout the evening. Detectives now had to consider whether the argument that began at the club had continued into the apartment and escalated beyond control. This possibility was supported by additional witness statements from friends who had been with Camithia earlier that night, describing her emotional state as increasingly agitated after observing Brian's interactions with another woman. One witness recalled her expressing anger and making direct threats in response to what she perceived as disrespect. While not proof of intent, these statements contributed to a broader picture of emotional escalation. Inside the interrogation process, Camithia's evolving narrative became a central focus. Her initial account of an external attacker had already been undermined, but under continued questioning, she introduced a different version of events, one that involved an argument inside the apartment between her and Brian. In this revised account, the conflict became physical, involving mutual struggle and the introduction of knives during the confrontation. This shift represented a critical turning point in the investigation, not because it confirmed guilt, but because it replaced an external unknown with an internal, relational explanation of violence. However, even this revised narrative contained inconsistencies. The sequence of events she described did not align neatly with the forensic evidence. The distribution of injuries on Brian suggested repeated, sustained attacks rather than a brief struggle for control of a weapon. The severity and number of wounds, particularly the deep throat injury, indicated an escalation beyond what would typically be expected in a spontaneous defensive encounter. Medical analysis further complicated her account. While Camithia had sustained injuries, forensic examination determined that several of her wounds were superficial in nature, inconsistent with the level of violence required to inflict the fatal injuries on Brian. This discrepancy raised questions about the dynamics of the struggle and whether her injuries occurred in the same manner or context as she described. At the same time, detectives began reconstructing Brian's final movements in greater detail. Witnesses confirmed that he had been at the club earlier, that he had interacted briefly with Camithia, and that he had left separately after a visible emotional disagreement. Phone records and timing analysis suggested that he returned to the apartment before or around the same time as Camithia. This overlapping timeline placed both individuals in the apartment during the critical window when the murder occurred. With no evidence of forced entry and no credible third-party suspect, investigators were left with a narrowing set of possibilities. The breakthrough moment came not as a dramatic confession or a new witness, but as the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence that all pointed away from the original narrative. Surveillance footage eliminated the stalker theory. Forensic evidence confirmed internal struggle. Witness statements established emotional volatility. The voicemail revealed relationship termination. And the crime scene itself showed no indication of external intrusion. When all these elements were viewed together, the structure of the case fundamentally changed. Investigators concluded that the most consistent explanation supported by evidence was that Brian and Camithia were the only individuals present during the fatal confrontation, and that the violence originated within their interaction rather than from an outside attacker. This conclusion led to a formal charging decision based on second-degree murder, reflecting the belief that the killing occurred during an intentional and escalating conflict rather than a random or external act of violence. The decision did not end debate within the investigative team, as cases of domestic violence often involve complex emotional and psychological dynamics that can obscure clear interpretations of intent. However, from an evidentiary standpoint, the convergence of physical, testimonial, and electronic evidence created a threshold that prosecutors believed could support a criminal case in court. As the legal process began to take shape, attention shifted from reconstruction of events to the question of motive and psychological context. Why did the situation escalate to such extreme violence? Was it driven by jealousy, emotional instability, fear of abandonment, or a combination of these factors under acute stress? These questions would later become central to courtroom arguments, but at the investigative stage, they remained secondary to the established sequence of physical events. What the breakthrough ultimately revealed was not a single moment of clarity, but the collapse of an alternative explanation that could no longer withstand scrutiny. The image of a mysterious stalker attacking from outside had been replaced by a far more troubling reality rooted in interpersonal conflict, emotional intensity, and irreversible escalation inside a closed environment. For detectives, the case was no longer about finding who entered the apartment, but about understanding how a relationship that appeared ordinary on the surface could culminate in such extreme violence behind closed doors. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the investigation that had begun in the middle of a violent night in Shreveport had already hardened into a legal narrative shaped by forensic certainty, witness accounts, and competing interpretations of the final moments inside Brian Spink's apartment. The question was no longer whether Brian had been killed by an unknown intruder. That theory had already collapsed under surveillance analysis, missing suspect verification, and the absence of any physical evidence supporting an external attacker. Instead, the trial centered on something far more intimate and unsettling: whether the fatal violence was the result of a domestic confrontation that escalated beyond control, and whether Camethea Coleman's actions that night constituted self-defense, manslaughter, or intentional homicide. In the courtroom, the atmosphere carried a tension that was less about mystery and more about moral interpretation. Everyone already knew Brian was dead, and everyone already knew Camethea had been present. What remained in dispute was the meaning of what had happened between them in those final minutes. The prosecution began by reconstructing the timeline in careful, methodical detail, presenting the jury with a sequence of events that placed Brian and Camethea at the nightclub earlier that evening, both separately and together, surrounded by witnesses who described rising emotional tension. They highlighted Brian's brief interaction with another woman on the dance floor, an interaction that witnesses described as casual, but which appeared to trigger a visible emotional reaction from Camethea. From there, prosecutors outlined how the couple left the club separately, entering a window of time that would become central to the case. The prosecution emphasized that no evidence supported the presence of a third party at the apartment. Surveillance footage from the club and surrounding areas showed no individual matching the description of a stalker. No witness placed such a person at or near the scene. No forensic evidence inside the apartment suggested forced entry. Instead, everything pointed inward, toward a private space shared by two people whose relationship was already under strain. The prosecution then turned to the crime scene itself, presenting photographs and forensic reports that documented the extreme violence inflicted on Brian Spinks. Jurors were shown the extent of his injuries, including dozens of stab wounds concentrated across his body and the fatal slash to his throat. Medical testimony explained that the number and distribution of wounds were inconsistent with a single defensive encounter against an unknown attacker and instead suggested sustained and repeated contact at close range. The presence of two kitchen knives, both taken from the same knife block, reinforced the idea that the weapons were chosen from inside the apartment rather than brought in by an outsider. One of those knives, broken during the attack, was presented as evidence of the force and intensity involved. Prosecutors argued that this was not a chaotic intrusion but a prolonged and personal confrontation that occurred within the apartment itself. They also introduced Brian's voicemail, left shortly before the killing, in which he clearly expressed his intention to end the relationship. This became a pivotal emotional element in the prosecution's narrative, reframing the night not as a random act of violence, but as the culmination of escalating relational conflict. According to their argument, the breakup announcement provided both context and catalyst for what followed. The defense, however, sought to dismantle this interpretation by focusing on the concept of reasonable doubt and the psychological state of Camethea Coleman. They argued that the initial 911 call described a violent home invasion, that Camethea herself had injuries consistent with an attack, and that in the immediate aftermath of trauma, her perception and memory could not be expected to remain stable or consistent. The defense emphasized her fear, shock, and confusion in the hours following the incident, suggesting that inconsistencies in her statements were the result of trauma rather than deception. A central pillar of the defense was the claim that Brian had a history of aggressive behavior toward Camethea, an argument they attempted to support through claims of emotional volatility and alleged prior conflicts. They introduced the idea that Camethea suffered from battered person syndrome, suggesting that prolonged emotional and psychological pressure within the relationship could have influenced her perception of danger and her response during the confrontation. According to this theory, she was not the aggressor, but a person reacting under extreme fear in a situation that escalated rapidly and unpredictably. The courtroom also revisited the earlier narrative of the mysterious stalker, though this theory had already been largely discredited during the investigation. The defense attempted to reintroduce doubt by suggesting that trauma could distort memory and that the absence of evidence did not necessarily prove absence of existence. However, prosecutors countered this by methodically revisiting the investigative steps that had eliminated the stalker theory, including surveillance footage, witness interviews, and the complete lack of physical or digital trace. Medical testimony became one of the most critical components of the trial. The coroner described in detail the extent of Brian's injuries, emphasizing the number of stab wounds and the deep, fatal wound to the throat. They explained that such an injury pattern was rarely consistent with defensive action alone and more often associated with sustained intent during a violent encounter. The medical expert also addressed Camethea's injuries, noting that they appeared superficial and did not align with the severity of force required to inflict the fatal wounds on Brian. This contrast became a focal point in the prosecution's argument, suggesting a disparity in force and control during the incident. One of the most emotionally charged moments in the trial came when the 911 recording was played for the jury. Brian's voice could be heard in the background, partially obscured by chaos, while Camethea's panicked call continued in real time. Prosecutors highlighted this recording as evidence that the fatal violence was unfolding while emergency services were being contacted, suggesting a direct link between the call and the final moments of Brian's life. The defense objected to this interpretation, but the emotional impact on the courtroom was undeniable. Witness testimony from friends and acquaintances further complicated the defense narrative. Several individuals described Camethea as increasingly possessive and emotionally reactive in the weeks leading up to the incident, particularly in relation to Brian's interactions with other women. Others described moments of visible tension between the couple that suggested underlying instability. While none of these accounts proved intent, they contributed to a broader portrait of a relationship under strain. Throughout the trial, Camethea maintained her plea of not guilty, with her defense shifting focus between self-defense and emotional breakdown under alleged abuse. However, prosecutors systematically dismantled each element of this argument by pointing to the absence of physical evidence supporting long-term abuse, the lack of police reports or documented incidents between Brian and Camethea, and the inconsistencies in her evolving statements about what happened inside the apartment. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution distilled their case into a single framework, that all credible evidence pointed to a domestic confrontation that escalated into lethal violence, and that attempts to introduce an external attacker had been disproven at every investigative level. The defense, meanwhile, urged the jury to consider the possibility of fear, trauma, and survival instinct in a rapidly unfolding and violent situation, warning against the danger of interpreting fragmented evidence as certainty. After deliberating for only a few hours, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Camethea Coleman was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom reaction was immediate but contained, a mixture of grief, disbelief, and finality settling over those who had followed the case from the beginning. The judge imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole, closing the legal chapter of a case that had begun with confusion, shifted through competing narratives, and ultimately resolved through the convergence of forensic evidence, timeline reconstruction, and elimination of alternative explanations. Outside the courtroom, reactions remained deeply divided. For Brian's family and friends, the verdict represented closure, though not healing, an acknowledgement of the violence that ended his life and the loss of a man they described as devoted, disciplined, and committed to his children. For others, particularly those who focused on the psychological dimensions of the case, questions about emotional dynamics and intent continued to linger, even after the legal system had reached its conclusion. What remained undeniable, however, was that the case had moved through every stage of investigative scrutiny, from chaotic uncertainty to evidentiary convergence, and had ultimately settled on a conclusion supported by the totality of available facts. The verdict in the courtroom did not arrive with spectacle or chaos. It came after hours of silence, the kind of silence that presses down on a room until even breathing feels too loud. Jurors who had spent days listening to testimony that shifted between love and violence, between memory and contradiction, finally reached a conclusion that would permanently define the fate of Camethea Coleman. When they returned, the words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. Guilty of second-degree murder. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. In that moment, the courtroom did not feel like a place of justice alone. It felt like the end of a long, unraveling story, one where every version of truth had been tested against the cold structure of forensic evidence, phone records, autopsy reports, and the uncomfortable gaps in human memory under pressure. The judge's sentence was delivered without hesitation, reflecting the severity of what investigators and prosecutors had spent months reconstructing. A young man stabbed dozens of times in his own apartment, a scene saturated with violence, and a narrative that shifted too many times to remain believable under scrutiny. For the family of Brian Spinks, the sentence brought a strange and complicated form of closure. It did not erase what had happened, and it did not soften the absence that now defined their lives. Brian had been more than a victim in an investigative file. He was a father, a son, a man whose life had been shaped by military service, long deployments, and a constant effort to remain present in the lives of children growing up far from him. His family did not speak of him as a statistic or a headline. They spoke of him as someone whose voice still echoed in memory, someone whose presence was felt in small inherited gestures, in the resemblance of a child, in the quiet reminders that grief often leaves behind. What made the aftermath especially difficult for those who knew him was the persistence of contradiction. In the early hours after the crime, there had been uncertainty, a brief window in which investigators considered the possibility of an external attacker, a stalker moving in the shadows of a seemingly ordinary relationship. But as evidence accumulated, that narrative collapsed under its own inconsistencies. There was no confirmed John with dreadlocks, no trace of forced entry, no supporting witness testimony from the club that could anchor his existence in reality. What remained instead was a relationship that had been eroding beneath the surface, marked by jealousy, emotional volatility, and escalating tension that had gone largely unseen by those outside of it. For investigators, the case became a lesson in how quickly perception can fracture when violence enters a domestic space. The early assumption of an external threat was not unusual. It reflected a common investigative pattern where initial victim accounts are given space until they can be verified or disproven. But in this case, every external lead eventually dissolved. Surveillance footage did not support the presence of a third party. Physical evidence did not align with the timeline of a stranger's intrusion. Even the injuries observed during autopsy, while extensive and brutal, aligned more consistently with a close-contact altercation than a chaotic break-in scenario involving an unknown assailant fleeing the scene. The autopsy itself became one of the defining pillars of the prosecution's case. The sheer number of stab wounds, documented at 64, suggested repeated force applied with intensity and persistence. The nature of the injuries indicated a struggle that did not end quickly, and the severity of the final wound to the throat pointed to a deliberate act intended to end life. These findings were not interpreted in isolation but were weighed alongside behavioral evidence, including shifting statements and the absence of corroboration for self-defense claims. Medical experts testified that the pattern of injuries did not align with an attempt to disengage or escape, but instead reflected sustained aggression. Yet beyond the forensic and legal dimensions, there remained the human aftermath, which no verdict could fully contain. For Brian's son, who had grown up with a father often physically distant due to military obligations, the loss took on a different emotional shape. It was not only the absence of a parent, but the abrupt rewriting of memory, the collision between who his father was known to be and how his death had been described in public discourse. Family members worked to preserve the image of Brian they had known, emphasizing his dedication, his effort to remain involved despite distance, and the sense of responsibility that had defined much of his adult life. On the other side of the case stood Camethea Coleman. Now separated from the world she had once navigated freely. During trial proceedings, her defense had attempted to construct a narrative centered on abuse and psychological pressure, suggesting that her actions were the result of accumulated trauma rather than intent. The court, however, found insufficient evidence to support this framing. No documented history of domestic violence was introduced that could substantiate claims of prolonged abuse. Friends and acquaintances described a relationship that, while strained in its later stages, did not match the severity of the defense's portrayal. This gap between narrative and evidence became central to the jury's deliberation. After sentencing, Camethea was removed from the courtroom, and with her departure, the legal chapter of the case formally ended. But for many involved, the psychological impact lingered far longer. Detectives who had worked the case recalled the difficulty of reconciling the emotional tone of early interviews with the physical reality of the crime scene. The image of a woman covered in blood, pleading for help, contrasted sharply with the forensic reconstruction that ultimately placed her at the center of the fatal encounter. This tension between perceived victimhood and established culpability remained one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation. In the months that followed, the apartment where the crime occurred was eventually cleared, its physical traces of violence erased through standard procedures. Yet for those who had entered it during the initial investigation, the memory of that space did not fade easily. The sound of footsteps on blood-soaked carpet, the overturned furniture, the disarray of a kitchen where knives had been taken from their place, all remained embedded in recollection. Crime scenes, for investigators, are never static images. They are sensory experiences that persist long after photographs are archived. Public reaction to the case was divided, as is often the case in crimes involving intimate relationships. Some focused on the brutality of the act itself, emphasizing the scale of violence and the loss of life. Others struggled with the psychological complexity of the relationship dynamics, attempting to reconcile the idea of a young woman from a respected background with the conviction that followed. These conflicting interpretations became part of broader conversations about domestic conflict, emotional escalation, and the difficulty of identifying danger within familiar spaces. Over time, however, the case settled into the larger landscape of true crime history not because of ambiguity, but because of its unsettling clarity. There was no mystery about who inflicted the fatal injuries. There was no unresolved suspect or lingering forensic contradiction. Instead, what remained was a sobering example of how quickly emotional conflict can escalate into irreversible violence, and how the absence of early intervention can allow that escalation to reach its most devastating conclusion. For Brian's family, the years that followed were marked by adaptation rather than resolution. Grief did not diminish, but it changed shape. It became part of daily life rather than an acute event. They spoke of him in present tense in private moments, as families often do when loss feels too large to fully accept as final. His presence was maintained through stories, through shared memories, through the continuation of his lineage in his children, who grew up hearing about a father they would never stop trying to understand. For the broader community, the case eventually became a cautionary reference point, not because it offered clear answers, but because it illustrated how complexity can exist within relationships that appear ordinary from the outside. It challenged assumptions about safety, familiarity, and the hidden fractures that can exist behind closed doors. It also reinforced a difficult truth that investigators often encounter, that violence within intimate relationships rarely emerges without warning signs, even if those signs are not always recognized at the time. In the end, the story of Brian Spinks and Camethea Coleman did not conclude with a sense of narrative resolution in the traditional sense. There was no restoration, no reversal, no return to equilibrium. There was only consequence, documentation, and the slow absorption of tragedy into memory. The legal system had delivered its judgment, but the human reality continued beyond it, carried forward by those who had to live with the absence left behind. And in that space, where law ends and life continues, The most enduring truth of the case remained not in the courtroom, nor in the evidence files, but in the silence that follows when a life is suddenly and irrevocably removed from the world it once moved through. There is a strange way that cases like this continue to exist long after the court has closed them. They do not remain alive in the legal sense, but in something quieter and more persistent. Memory, documentation, and the way people reconstruct meaning from something that never fully makes emotional sense. Years after the conviction, the apartment where Brian Spinks died was no longer marked by police tape or forensic markers. The walls had been repainted, the carpet replaced, the physical traces of violence removed through routine restoration. But spaces remember in a different way than people do. For those who had stood inside during the initial investigation, the memory of that room did not align with its current appearance. It was difficult to reconcile a normal living space with what had unfolded there in a matter of minutes that felt, in testimony and reconstruction, both chaotic and strangely methodical. In homicide investigations, there is often a belief that clarity will eventually resolve emotional weight. That once the facts are established, once the sequence of events is understood, the mind will settle. But cases involving intimate relationships rarely follow that pattern. Instead, they leave behind layered interpretations, each one attempting to impose order on behavior that, at its core, was driven by emotional volatility, personal history, and moments of escalation that cannot be fully reconstructed through evidence alone. For the investigators who worked the case, the passage of time did not erase the details. It reorganized them. What once felt like an urgent puzzle gradually became a case study in behavioral escalation and narrative instability. Early confusion about a possible external attacker gave way to a more consolidated understanding of interpersonal dynamics. The so-called John figure, once treated as a viable lead, became an example in investigative training discussions about how quickly an unverified narrative can shape early direction if not carefully tested against physical evidence. The absence of John was not just a factual correction. It was a turning point in how the entire case was understood. Surveillance footage, phone records, witness statements, and forensic analysis collectively dismantled the idea of a third-party intruder. Once that narrative collapsed, investigators were left with a narrower, more uncomfortable reality that the violence had occurred within the confines of a relationship that, to outsiders, had not appeared to be on the verge of collapse in such a catastrophic way. In hindsight, friends and acquaintances of both Brian and Camethea revisited moments they had once considered ordinary. Conversations that now seemed heavier in meaning. Arguments that had been dismissed as typical relationship tension. Changes in behavior that were only recognized as significant after they had been reframed by the outcome. This retrospective reinterpretation is common in cases like this, where the end result forces a reassessment of the past. But it is also unreliable in a forensic sense because it is shaped by knowledge of what came later. What remained consistent across all accounts, however, was the recognition that the relationship had become unstable in its final stages. Jealousy had been mentioned repeatedly. Control issues were described in varying degrees of intensity, depending on the source. Emotional dependency appeared to deepen while trust eroded. These patterns, while not uncommon in intimate relationships, took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of what ultimately occurred inside that apartment. The legal process had already determined responsibility, but the broader question of how and why relationships reach such points of irreversible violence continued to linger. Prosecutors had focused on intent and action, supported by forensic evidence that showed a level of force inconsistent with defensive behavior. The defense, meanwhile, had attempted to frame the situation as one of psychological pressure and reactive violence under perceived threat. The jury ultimately rejected that interpretation, but the existence of competing narratives remained part of the case's lasting complexity. One of the more difficult aspects for those who study the case was the role of perception in the earliest moments of the investigation. When officers first arrived at the scene, they were confronted with chaos, blood, confusion, and a surviving individual who was injured, distressed, and attempting to explain what had happened. In such moments, initial statements are often treated as provisional rather than definitive. Trauma affects memory, sequencing, and clarity. This is why investigators are trained to separate immediate accounts from corroborated evidence. However, in this case, the initial narrative of a stalking figure introduced a directional bias that took time to fully unravel. It is not uncommon for early investigative paths to shift dramatically once physical evidence is fully processed. What matters in such cases is not the initial hypothesis, but the willingness to abandon it when it no longer aligns with objective findings. That adjustment, while procedurally routine, is psychologically difficult in cases involving violent death because it forces investigators to recontextualize the emotional weight of early victim statements. For Brian's family, the years following the trial were defined less by the specifics of the case and more by the absence it created. Legal outcomes do not restore relationships or reconstruct daily life. They simply establish a formal conclusion to responsibility. The emotional aftermath exists outside that structure. It continues in birthdays, in missed conversations, in the presence of children who grow older without one parent, and in the persistent effort to maintain a sense of continuity despite disruption. There is also a particular burden carried by families in cases that receive public attention. Even when media coverage fades, the case itself does not fully disappear from public record. It remains accessible, searchable, and periodically resurfaced in discussions about crime, relationships, or legal outcomes. This means that private grief exists alongside a permanent public archive, creating a dual experience of memory, one personal and one external. For those who followed the case more broadly, it became part of a larger pattern of discussions about domestic violence, relationship escalation, and the difficulty of identifying risk within familiar environments. It challenged simplistic assumptions about how violence manifests. There was no single dramatic warning sign that, in isolation, predicted the outcome. Instead, there were overlapping tensions, emotional volatility, and unresolved conflicts that gradually intensified until they reached a breaking point. In academic and investigative contexts, cases like this are often referenced when discussing the concept of relational escalation. This refers to the gradual increase in intensity of conflict within intimate partnerships, where emotional dependency and interpersonal tension create conditions in which disputes become more severe over time. Not every escalating relationship results in violence, but the framework helps explain how ordinary disagreements can, in rare and extreme cases, evolve into irreversible outcomes. Another aspect frequently discussed is the reliability of self-reported narratives in the immediate aftermath of traumatic events. When individuals are injured or emotionally overwhelmed, their accounts may shift as new information emerges or as their own understanding of events evolves. This does not automatically imply deception. Rather, it reflects the complexity of memory under stress. However, when physical evidence contradicts early narratives, investigators must prioritize objective findings over subjective recollection. In this case, the physical evidence was particularly decisive. The number and distribution of injuries, the absence of forced entry, and the lack of corroborating evidence for an external suspect all contributed to a reconstruction of events that differed significantly from the initial account provided at the scene. Once this reconstruction was established, the focus of the investigation narrowed accordingly. Even after conviction, discussions about the case occasionally returned to the question of intent versus reaction, control versus breakdown, and how relationships can deteriorate in ways that are not immediately visible to those outside them. These are not questions that produce simple answers, but they remain central to understanding the broader implications of such cases. For those closest to Brian, however, these analytical frameworks exist alongside something more personal and less structured: memory. Memory of who he was before the case became defined by its ending. Memory of conversations that were not about violence or investigation but about ordinary life. And memory of a presence that is no longer physically accessible but remains emotionally significant. In the end, the case does not resolve into a single interpretation that satisfies every perspective. It exists instead as a convergence of facts, perceptions, legal findings, and personal experiences that do not fully align but must coexist. The law provides conclusion. Investigation provides structure. But human understanding remains partial. And that is often where cases like this leave their most lasting impact. Not in the certainty of what was proven, but in the lingering awareness that even within familiar relationships, the boundary between stability and collapse can shift in ways that are not always visible until it is already too late. Even long after a case is closed in court, it rarely closes in life. It continues to echo in smaller, quieter ways, in places where legal language no longer reaches. For investigators, time eventually moves the Spinks case into the category of resolved, a label that in practice means something very specific: responsibility established, charges adjudicated, sentence carried out. But resolved does not mean understood in a complete emotional sense. It simply means the system has reached the end of what it can formally do. After that point, the case stops being active work and becomes memory inside institutional archives. Yet even in that transition, certain cases resist fading into abstraction. This one did because it was built on contradictions that people naturally struggle to fully compartmentalize. A relationship that began in ordinary settings between people who looked, by all external measures, compatible. A night that began with social movement, communication, and routine interaction. And then an abrupt collapse into violence, so severe that it redefined every prior assumption about what the relationship had been. What made it particularly difficult for those who revisited the case years later was not only the brutality itself, but the speed at which interpretation changed. Early in the investigation, officers operated under a framework that included an external threat. That framework was not careless. It was logical, based on the first available testimony. A stranger, a stalker, a figure reported by a witness who was herself injured and in shock. In real time, investigators do not have the luxury of hindsight. They build the most plausible structure from incomplete pieces and adjust as new evidence arrives. But this case required a full dismantling of that initial structure. The John narrative collapsed not because of a single contradiction, but because of accumulation. No verified identity. No physical trace. No surveillance confirmation. No consistent witness overlap. Each investigative layer that was meant to support the existence of an external perpetrator failed independently. And when multiple independent systems all fail to confirm the same element, investigators are trained to reconsider the foundation entirely. What replaced it was not a dramatic revelation, but a narrowing of possibilities. Two people inside the space. One survivor. One deceased. A timeline that no longer required an external variable to explain what occurred. This shift is often emotionally uncomfortable, even in professional settings, because it reassigns meaning. It changes the direction of suspicion from an unknown threat to a known relationship. And relationships are inherently more complex to analyze because they are built on shared history rather than isolated presence. In the months that followed the trial, those who had testified or worked closely on the case did not describe it in sensational terms. Instead, they often described it as heavy, a word that reflects not just the severity of the crime, but the psychological weight of reconstructing it. When you spend enough time with a case like this, it stops being a set of facts and becomes a sequence of irreversible human decisions. For the family of Brian Spinks, time did not operate in the same structured way as it did in the justice system. There is no procedural closure in personal loss. There is only adaptation. Birthdays continue. Children grow. Conversations shift from present tense to memory. And over time, grief becomes less of a sudden impact and more of a constant background presence. What remained especially important for his family was the preservation of identity against distortion. In cases that become public, victims risk being defined primarily by the manner of their death rather than the fullness of their life. His family's effort to emphasize his service, his role as a father, and his efforts to maintain connection despite distance was not just emotional expression, it was a form of resistance against reduction. They spoke about him not as an abstract victim, but as someone with habits, humor, and responsibility. Someone who had spent years navigating separation due to military duty and still attempted to remain present in his children's lives. In their perspective, that was the version of him that mattered most. On the other side of the case, the legal conclusion did not end public discussion entirely. Cases involving domestic relationships and severe violence often continue to circulate in broader conversations about warning signs, emotional escalation, and the difficulty of identifying risk inside intimate partnerships. But over time, even those discussions tend to simplify complex situations into more digestible narratives because complexity is difficult to sustain in public memory. One of the more frequently revisited themes in this case is the idea of perception versus evidence. In the early hours, perception suggested an external attacker. Evidence later suggested internal conflict. Both cannot be true simultaneously, yet both existed at different stages of the same investigation. This is not unusual in violent crime investigations, but it becomes more striking when the early narrative is emotionally compelling. Another theme that emerges is the role of injury interpretation. The surviving individual presented with injuries that were initially consistent with victimization. However, forensic analysis later raised questions about timing, depth, and causation. In legal contexts, injury is not interpreted in isolation. It is compared against mechanism, opportunity, and consistency with other physical evidence. When discrepancies appear, they must be resolved through corroboration or reclassification. These technical distinctions matter because they determine how narratives are constructed in court. But outside of court, they intersect with human interpretation in more complicated ways. People tend to assign meaning based on emotional resonance first and evidentiary structure second. This is why early narratives in high-profile cases can persist in public perception even after they have been legally discredited. Over time, the Spinks case became less about mystery and more about pattern recognition. Not in the sense of predicting individual behavior, but in understanding how escalation can occur within relationships that do not outwardly appear unstable to observers. It reinforced a difficult truth that law enforcement and social researchers often emphasize. The absence of visible conflict does not guarantee the absence of underlying tension. It also highlighted the limitations of reconstructing emotional states after violence has occurred. Investigators can determine sequence, force, and physical interaction. They can establish presence and absence. But they cannot fully reconstruct internal emotional thresholds that lead to irreversible action. Those remain partially inaccessible, even when every physical detail is known. As years passed, the case slowly transitioned into archival status, referenced in training contexts and analytical discussions rather than active investigation. New cases replaced it in daily workload, as they always do. But certain cases leave behind patterns that continue to inform future understanding. For those directly affected, however, the case does not become archival. It remains personal history. It is carried forward in family memory, in the lives of children who grow up with absence as a defining structure, and in the ongoing effort to maintain identity beyond the moment of loss. In the end, what remains most persistent is not the legal classification of the act, nor the procedural outcome, but the human fragmentation it leaves behind. One life ended abruptly. Another life permanently altered in trajectory. And a circle of family and friends left to integrate something that has no equivalent in ordinary experience. There is no final explanatory layer that fully resolves that kind of event. There is only the gradual acceptance that some moments in time become permanent divides, everything before and everything after. And for those who revisit the case years later, whether as investigators, analysts, or members of the public, that divide is what lingers most strongly. Not the details of the investigation alone, but the realization that ordinary life can shift into irreversible consequence in a span of time too short to fully comprehend while it is happening. Even after the case had long left the active investigative stage, its presence continued to surface in unexpected ways, usually not as a headline but as a reference point. In training discussions, in courtroom briefings for unrelated cases, and in quiet professional conversations among detectives, the Spinks case would occasionally reappear, not because it was unresolved, but because it was instructive in a way that is difficult to replicate through theory alone. It forced a confrontation with something law enforcement encounters repeatedly, but never fully normalizes: the instability of first impressions in violent incidents. The initial 911 call, the injured survivor, the description of an unknown attacker, all of it fit a pattern that investigators are trained to take seriously. In those first hours, there is no luxury of certainty. Every fragment of information is treated as potentially critical. But what this case demonstrated, in a way that remained relevant long after, was how quickly a plausible narrative can form around incomplete data and how carefully that narrative must be tested against physical reality before it becomes directional. The shift from external suspect to internal responsibility did not happen abruptly. It happened through incremental erosion. Each new piece of evidence did not announce itself as definitive. Instead, it quietly failed to support the original framework. A missing suspect identity here, a surveillance gap there, a forensic inconsistency that could not be reconciled with the timeline. Investigators do not often describe these moments as dramatic turning points. More often, they describe them as quiet corrections, repeated until the structure of the case no longer supports its initial shape. By the time the legal system reached its conclusion, the narrative had already stabilized around physical evidence rather than early testimony. But even then, the emotional residue of the first version of events did not disappear completely. This is one of the less discussed realities of homicide investigation, that once a story enters the minds of responders, it leaves an imprint that is not easily overwritten, even when disproven. In the broader public sphere, the case never became one of the most sensationalized examples of violent crime, but it persisted in smaller discussions about trust, relationships, and perception. What made it resonate was not complexity in the legal sense, but familiarity in the relational sense. It involved people who did not initially appear disconnected from ordinary life. There were no extreme external circumstances that explained the breakdown in an obvious way. Instead, it unfolded within a context that many people recognize: relationships marked by emotional intensity, miscommunication, and escalating conflict that is not always visible from the outside. That familiarity is part of what makes such cases difficult to process. When violence emerges from within a context that appears ordinary, it forces a reconsideration of assumptions about safety and predictability. It challenges the idea that outward stability is a reliable indicator of internal stability. And it raises questions that do not have simple resolution about how well we can ever truly understand the dynamics of relationships that are not our own. For Brian Spink's family, time continued forward in a way that was both structured and fragmented. Structured in the sense that life inevitably moves through routines, responsibilities, and generational continuity. Fragmented in the sense that absence does not integrate neatly into those routines. It exists alongside them, unchanged by the passage of time. His children grew, milestones occurred, and family narratives adapted to include his memory as something present rather than something concluded. In families affected by violent loss, memory often becomes a form of preservation. Not preservation of the event itself, but of the person prior to the event. The emphasis shifts toward maintaining identity against the flattening effect that public records can sometimes produce. A case file reduces a life to a sequence of events. Families resist that reduction by reinforcing the broader context of who the person was outside of the moment in which their life ended. On the investigative side, the case also became part of a larger conversation about how emotional narratives influence early reporting. The presence of a named suspect, even one later determined to be non-existent, demonstrated how quickly cognitive anchoring can occur during crisis response. Once a specific explanation enters the investigative environment, it can shape perception until evidence forces its removal. This is not unique to this case, but this case became a clear example of the phenomenon. Another aspect that continued to be referenced was the interpretation of physical injury patterns. The severity of the wounds, the distribution, and the nature of the trauma were central to reconstructing intent and sequence. In forensic analysis, injuries are not simply counted. They are interpreted in relation to force, angle, repetition, and defensive response. In this case, the pattern suggested sustained interaction rather than a brief, interrupted encounter. That distinction became critical in distinguishing between competing narratives presented during the early stages of the investigation and later court proceedings. Over time, the case also contributed to ongoing discussions about how emotional volatility within relationships can escalate without external visibility. This does not imply predictability in individual cases, but it does reinforce a broader understanding that relationship conflict can intensify in private ways that are not always reflected in public behavior. That gap between external perception and internal reality is one of the recurring challenges in domestic violence investigations. Yet, even with all of the analytical frameworks applied to it, the case ultimately resists full containment within any single explanation. It is simultaneously a forensic reconstruction, a legal outcome, and a personal tragedy experienced by multiple individuals in different ways. Each of those perspectives is valid within its own domain, but none of them fully encompass the entirety of what occurred. For those who revisit the case years later, whether professionally or out of interest, what often stands out is not any single piece of evidence, but the way the entire sequence shifts as understanding deepens. The initial clarity of a suspected intruder gives way to uncertainty. That uncertainty is replaced by evidentiary alignment. And that alignment, while legally sufficient, does not erase the emotional difficulty of the earlier narrative. In the end, the Spinks case remains less about mystery and more about transition. Transition from assumption to evidence, from perception to reconstruction, from narrative possibility to legal conclusion. And beneath all of that, the quieter transition that cannot be measured in court records, the shift in the lives of those who are connected to the people involved and who must continue forward carrying a history that cannot be rewritten. What remains is not resolution in the emotional sense, but continuity. The continuity of memory for a life that ended abruptly, and the continuity of impact that extends far beyond the moment the case was closed in the justice system.